All right, so today we're going to talk about Betsy Ross and her association with the first American flag. Obviously, she's been depicted in a lot of different ways with the flag in our culture. Upper left here, you see a Halloween costume, her holding a flag, you have an ornament with the flag. This is actually a certificate from the American Flag House and Betsy Ross Memorial Association, which you joined that and you got these certificates. This was the early 20th century they did this. You have a stamp and you have a figurine here. And they actually made a movie about Betsy Ross in 1917 with Alice Brady. I think it was a silent film all about her making the flag. However, how much of this story about her making the flag, first flag, is actually true? And who is the real Betsy Ross? So who we know as Betsy Ross was born Elizabeth Griscom on January 1st, 1752 in Gloucester City, New Jersey. Her parents were Rebecca and Samuel Griscom. Her father Samuel worked as a carpenter, and the family lived in a small farmhouse in New Jersey. They were also Quakers. She was in fact known as Betsy her entire life and not Elizabeth. However, when she would sign her name to documents, she would sign Elizabeth and her last name, or E and her last name. Here you can see this is actually her writing out her name here. Samuel and Rebecca would have numerous additional children, and in 1764, when Betsy was 12 years old, the family moved out of their farmhouse in New Jersey and went across the Delaware to Philadelphia. Samuel's job as a carpenter was very lucrative, and he bought a nice house on Arch Street between 3rd and 4th Street in the city. So this is actually where the house was on Arch Street, over here to the left. Actually, to the left is the Friends Meeting House. To the right is where the house was. It's long gone, but this is where Betsy would have grown up. Betsy also attended the Friends Public School on 4th Street in Philadelphia, where she was taught reading, writing, to adhere to like a distinct Quaker values, even if it meant setting her apart from society. The original building for that is also long gone, but there's a sign that talks about the school. So when Betsy was 15 years old, she walked into John Webster's upholstery shop, which was on Chestnut Street, very close to her house. In what became a moment that would change her life, John Webster decided to hire Betsy to do upholstery work. She worked for John Webster for about 6 years, from 1767 to 1773. She'd make blankets, rugs, bed tickings, mattresses, chairs, beds, women's stays. This was complex and challenging work, and she'd sometimes work up to 16 hours a day. Basically, as long as it was light out, she'd be working. Her biggest client at the time was a wealthy Philadelphia merchant named John Cadwalader, who later was involved with the American Revolution. He served in Washington's army, and he played a large role in Washington crossing the Delaware in December of 1776. Here you can see John Cadwalader on the right, and here's an image on the left of what an upholstery shop might have looked like back in the day. You see some probably customers here looking at a chair, and see the women working in the background there. John Webster needed additional employees to help with all the business he was getting, and soon he hired a young man by the name of John Ross, who was about 18 years old at the time. The Ross family were a large family, originally from Newcastle in Delaware. So Betsy would meet John Ross at Webster's shop, and they fell in love. However, there was a problem. John was Anglican, and as we mentioned, Betsy was Quaker. So Betsy's parents obviously didn't approve of this relationship between Betsy and John or any potential marriage. Soon John and Betsy eloped and were married on November 4th, 1773 at Hugg's Tavern in New Jersey. Betsy decided that she was going to join the Anglican congregation with her husband. This is actually a photo of Hugg's Tavern in New Jersey where the couple got married. This was taken in the 1920s. I believe the building's been torn down now, but it was still there as of the early 20th century. So soon after they were married, Betsy and John would leave Webster's shop and start their own upholstery business. The couple also bought their own house in Philadelphia on Chestnut Street between Front and 2nd Street. Their biggest client at the time was Benjamin Chew, who you can see here on the left. He owned Cliveden, or also known as the Chew House, which would later be the site of the Battle of Germantown. The upholstery business that Betsy and John ran became a huge success, and everything seemed to be going well for the couple when tragedy struck. In January 1776, John Ross passed away suddenly. What exactly happened to him? It's a bit shrouded in mystery. The common story is that he died guarding a local munitions site. And basically he was guarding it and it blew up and he was killed. However, this is unlikely since there's no record of any munitions explosion around that time. Another possibility is that he contracted some type of illness and passed away. There's also a family history of mental illness. John's mother had been institutionalized most of her adult life. And there is some anecdotal evidence in the affidavits that John may have also suffered from mental health issues, but we can't say for sure. Betsy was very silent when it came to what happened to her first husband. So Betsy Ross now found herself widowed at just the age of 23. She moved out of the house that her and John lived in, and she eventually sold it. She bought a house of her own and did not move back in with her parents, which seemed to indicate that she was possibly estranged at the time with them over joining the Anglican Church. All of this was essentially happening to Betsy on the eve of the American Revolution. In 1775, you have the battles of Lexington and Concord, and soon war broke out with Great Britain. Betsy, of course, resided in the colonial capital of Philadelphia, and in 1776, the Second Continental Congress met at the Pennsylvania State House, today known as Independence Hall, to begin discussing a break from Great Britain. Okay, so now we have the traditional story of the Betsy Ross story. I want to preface by saying the story of the first American flag is complicated, very convoluted, and in some ways very controversial. And when one begins to research this situation, it can very quickly bring about all kinds of confusion when trying to piece it all together. Generally, the more you research something, the clearer it becomes. However, I found kind of the inverse to be true here. The more I researched this, the less clear it was. So with that being said, this is not a comprehensive study of the American flag or 18th century flag making in general, but I tried my best to explain Betsy's role in the first American flag, or perhaps her lack of role. So this is the traditional story as told by Betsy's daughter, Rachel Claypool, in a sworn affidavit from the last quarter of the 19th century. I believe it was 1871 there. And this affidavit was later used by Betsy's grandson, William Canby, to claim that Betsy designed and made the first flag. And the story is as follows. Sometime in the spring of 1776, just before independence was declared, George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross, who was the uncle of John Ross, walked into Betsy's upholstery shop on Arch Street with a sketch of a flag. They were there as part of a congressional committee that had been put together by the Continental Congress to produce an American flag. They asked Betsy to make a specimen American flag of the sketch. She puts together a flag with red and white stripes with a blue canton, changes the 6-point stars to 5-point stars. The flag is then brought before the Continental Congress and approved. And just like that, we have the first American flag, partially designed by and made by Betsy Ross. So here you can see the well-known image of the first American flag, today known as the quote-unquote Betsy Ross flag. Here we have, which I think was the first depiction of the whole traditional story, with George Washington, George Ross, Robert Morris meeting with Betsy to get the flag, and George Ross and Robert Morris would later go on to sign the Declaration of Independence. However, it quickly becomes apparent that there are numerous problems with this traditional story. The first one is the timing of it. Why would the Continental Congress be focused on a new American flag months before independence was declared and over a year before the Flag Act was passed? The presence of Robert Morris in this story doesn't make a lot of sense because Morris was not in favor of a break from Great Britain in May of 1776, and he even voted against American independence in July of 1776. However, he would later go on to sign the Declaration, as I just mentioned, in August of 76. But why would he be part of any committee to create a new flag for an effort that he did not support? George Ross was not part of the Continental Congress in May of 76 and was not reelected until July of that year. So there's no way he could have been part of any congressional committee if he was not part of Continental Congress. George Washington was in fact in Philadelphia in May of 76, so that does check out, but he was also not part of the Continental Congress at the time. He was the commander-in-chief of the Army. Washington makes no mention of this event in any letters, diaries, or anything, despite keeping very detailed accounts of his whereabouts at that time. Probably the most definitive proof that this story is at the very least somewhat false is that the Continental Congress, who kept minutes from all the proceedings, makes no mention of any congressional committee for a flag or any specimen flag being presented or approved in 76 or even in 1777 for that matter. So now let's talk about the design of this flag. Could this have potentially been the design of the first American flag? It's possible, but there is at least some evidence that this design was not used during the war. While the official flag design of the American flag that was passed, or the Flag Act that was passed in 1777 seems to describe the Betsy Ross flag, with the stars being arranged in a circle, actual examples of this design being used during the American Revolution are non-existent. Interestingly enough, the original affidavits by Betsy's relatives make no mention of her creating a flag that had stars in a circle like that. So there was also apparently a national American flag carried by the 3rd Maryland at the Battle of Cowpens in 1780. Here you can see that design, which is a little bit different from the Betsy Ross design, where it has the stars in the circle, but there's also a star in the center. The problem with this Cowpens flag is that the 3rd Maryland, who supposedly carried it at Cowpens, were not actually at Cowpens. And this flag, this specimen flag, didn't show up until the 19th century. So that being said, there are some images from the 1790s that do in fact show a flag similar to this design being used. So it's a little bit unclear. To further complicate the issue, signer of the Declaration of Independence, Francis Hopkinson, submitted a bill for creating the national flag. Here is Francis Hopkinson on the left, and the design that he submitted is on the right. The problem here is that in subsequent letters, Hopkinson wrote requesting payment. He dropped the mention of a national flag and said he was only requesting payment for a naval flag. So there are also no examples of this flag being used during the American Revolution. I actually prefer the look of this flag over the Betsy Ross design, perhaps because it looks more like the flag we have today. But you might notice that the stars or the stripes are actually reversed. Instead of it being red, white, red, white, red, white, it's white, red, white, red. So it's a bit different. Probably shouldn't have put that on a white background, but you kind of get the idea. So this situation with Hopkinson kind of brings up an interesting point. There were all different kinds of flags. We had military flags for mounted troops, which were standards. You had military flags for ground troops, which were colors. You had flags flown at the stern of the ship, which were ensigns, and flags flown at the bow of the ship, which were known as jacks. So these labels can be broken down even further. For example, you could be talking about colors. They could be division colors, regimental colors. They could be colors for the fife and drum. So the problem is when we have sources that are talking about quote-unquote flags from the American Revolution, sometimes we can't be exactly sure what type of flag they're referring to because there were just so many different types. What we know today as the Betsy Ross flag first appears on the national seal in 1783, just after the war is over. Here you can see that the national seal and the flag is there. I've kind of blown it up here on this side. However, although you can't see it in the photo, this flag actually has 6-point stars and not the 5-point stars commonly associated with the Betsy Ross flag. And You can also see it does the same thing the Hopkinson flag does, where it starts with the white instead of the red. So while it's kind of the Betsy Ross design with the stars in the circle, it's not 100% the Betsy Ross flag. So there's also an interesting letter from the Board of War to George Washington, dated May 10th, 1779. This is nearly 2 years after the Flag Act was passed and 3 years after Betsy Ross apparently produced the first flag. And the letter reads in part, quote, "The Baron Steuben mentioned when he was here that he would settle with your excellency some plan as to the colors. It was intended that every regiment should have 2 colors. One the standard of the United States, which should be the same throughout the army, and the other a regimental color, which should vary according to the facings of the regiment. But it is not yet settled what is the standard of the United States." So based on this letter alone, it seems that the design of the American flag was not yet settled in 1779. This letter does have some support, as the Smithsonian Museum found at least 17 variants of flags with 13 stars that dated between 1779 and 1796. As you're probably starting to see, this is kind of a complex issue, and we're just scratching the surface of it. So the bottom line is there's no documented proof that Betsy Ross designed or produced the first American flag, and there's no documented proof that the design we currently know as the Betsy Ross flag was used during the American Revolution. People tend to look for firsts, first flag, first person to make the flag, but it's far more likely that there is no exact first flag or first person to make an American flag, and the American flag is something that simply evolved over time. So what is known about Betsy's relationship with flag making? Well, we know that she certainly made flags during the war. In early 1777, she was paid to make a naval flag for the Pennsylvania Navy. Here is the receipt for that naval flag, and as you can see, it says underlined there, "for the making of ship's colors." We also know that without question that Betsy continued to make flags. Excuse me. Flags for the rest of her life. This is a really cool receipt from 1813 from Caesar Rodney to Betsy for the making of an American ensign, which would have been a ship's flag. This document is currently in the Delaware State Archives, but you can see where her name is. You can see Caesar A. Rodney there. So now this is not the Caesar Rodney we all know. This is Caesar Rodney's nephew, Caesar Augustus Rodney, who, as an aside, might have had troops on Iron Hill during the War of 1812. That's something that's been written, but I'm still trying to find an original source for that. So this is a cool little piece of Delaware history connected to Betsy. Now, could Caesar A. Rodney have potentially carried a flag made by Betsy to Iron Hill during the War of 1812? Now, I'm not saying that that happened at all, but it is mildly amusing that this guy, who was apparently on Iron Hill during the War of 1812, may have potentially been in contact with Betsy Ross, and who was certainly making flags for him. Ironically, Betsy remarried on the day after the Flag Act was passed. In June 1777, Betsy married a man by the name of Joseph Ashburn. Not much is known about Joseph's early life or how he met Betsy. However, what is known is that he was at sea for much of their relationship. He would show up for like a month or two in Philadelphia, and then he'd be gone again for a year. When the British occupied Philadelphia on September 25th, 1777, it is unclear if Betsy remained in the city or fled to New Jersey. However, from the little evidence that we have, it appears as though she did remain in her home on Arch Street. As a brief aside, her father, Samuel Griscom, who was a Quaker, so he's supposed to remain neutral, he signed an oath of loyalty to America on September 3rd, 1777, which was the same day as the Battle of Queens Bridge. After the British left Philadelphia in June of 1778, prices of goods began to skyrocket, and Betsy fell on hard times. To make additional money, she began to produce cannon carriages for the war effort, in addition to her work in upholstery. So now she's doing woodworking for cannon carriages. So Betsy had a daughter with Joseph named Zillah, but sadly she lived for less than a year. Soon Betsy was pregnant again, and Joseph decided it was time to go back to sea. Sadly, this is the last time that Betsy would ever see Joseph. While at sea, he was captured by the British and held as a prisoner of war. Joseph passed away in captivity in May of 1782, just as the American Revolution was winding down. Here's where it gets a little bit strange. The man who was with Joseph when he passed away came back to Philadelphia to inform Betsy of her husband's passing. And just 6 months later, Betsy would marry that man. His name was John Claypool. Betsy and John Claypool would be married on May 3rd, 1783. This was by far Betsy's most successful marriage. They remained married until Joseph's passing in 1817, and they had 5 additional children in addition to the daughter that Betsy had with Joseph Ashburn, who did survive. Like Betsy and John Ross had done a decade earlier, Betsy and John Claypool would run an upholstery business together. It was also around this time that Betsy rejoined being a Quaker. However, it's a little bit different. There was like a new society that was formed from all the Quakers that had been outcast from the community after the war, and they were called the Religious Society of Friends, or Free Quakers. In August of 1793, when Betsy was 41 years old, a yellow fever epidemic hit Philadelphia, killing over 5,000 people in the city, which was approximately 10% of the population of Philadelphia at that time. Thankfully, Betsy, her husband, and children were spared from the disease. However, tragically, Betsy lost both of her parents, Samuel and Rebecca, and her daughter, Deborah, in just the course of a week to yellow fever. The disease was caused by mosquitoes, but at the time, they couldn't figure that out. It's interesting that they noticed that people who constantly smoked tobacco were less likely to get yellow fever, but they couldn't figure out why that was. We know today that it was probably the tobacco smoke that was keeping away the mosquitoes. So there's not much known about Betsy's later life. However, from all accounts, it was relatively happy. She did continue with her upholstery business up until 1827, when her eyesight began to fail her. She soon retired and moved in with her daughter, Susanna. Apparently, to help with her eyesight, Betsy began taking snuff, which was powdered tobacco that you sniff. This is her tin snuff box here that is currently in the Betsy Ross House collection. On a personal note, I actually found this kind of interesting because as a reenactor, after a 14-mile march, someone passed around this snuff box in a tin that looked very, very close to this. And after like sleep deprivation and the march, I was looking for anything to help me. So I tried some, and I can't say that it helped with my eyesight anyway, but certainly woke me up and burned my nostrils and throat really bad. Yep. Okay, so Betsy Ross's health continued to fail, and she passed away on January 30th, 1836 at the age of 84. She lived quite a while. This is her quote-unquote grave at the Betsy Ross House site. However, in all likelihood, she's not buried here. She was initially buried at the Friends Burial Ground. However, when they began to expand the roads and build on that site, they supposedly moved her body to Mount Moriah Cemetery in 1856. However, if you know anything about Philadelphia, you'll know that it's built on a lot of old cemeteries. And they say they moved the bodies in the cemetery before they built, but in many cases they didn't. Probably a good example of that would be the Constitution Center, which is actually built on top of an old cemetery where the bodies were apparently moved, and then they went to go put the basement in, and they discovered that there were hundreds of graves there. In any event, when they established the Betsy Ross House as a historical site, they wanted to relocate Betsy's remains there, but they didn't find any remains under her headstone in Mount Moriah Cemetery. They dug around in other areas near her plot and found some remains, or some say it's just some dirt, and they determined that to be her, and they relocated that to the current Betsy Ross House site. However, in all likelihood, she's still buried at the Friends Burial Ground on Arch Street, or she was buried there until the construction disturbed her grave. So there's also another issue, and it's somewhat disputed, about whether Betsy Ross ever actually lived in the Betsy Ross house. There's an interesting write-up that was done online where they compared the city directory of the time with maps that showed street numbers. Then the street numbers changed, so they matched up the old names with the new numbers, and there was conflicting information. I'll be honest, I've read what they put together at least 3 times. I don't fully understand it, but I'll take their word for it that it's questionable whether Betsy Ross lived in the house, now known as the Betsy Ross House. However, if she didn't live there, she lived in the lot which was next to the Betsy Ross house, where the Betsy Ross gift shop is currently located. So I wanted to say that while Betsy Ross might not have designed or made the first American flag, her skills in upholstery work and her contribution to the American Revolution were amazing accomplishments. I know someone who makes 100% accurate museum quality 18th century replicas of items. He does like clothing, shoes, leather breeches, cartridge boxes, and he's known as kind of the go-to person for those items. And I remember him telling me that women's stays were a never again project for him, that they were extremely difficult to make, and that it was something that he kind of did once and had no desire to do again. So these were items that Betsy would make on a daily basis. So her skills as in upholstery cannot be understated. Perhaps to illustrate this further, in 1987, an easy chair owned by John Cadwallader was put up for auction and sold for $2.75 million. Now, there's no proof that this chair actually came from Webster's or Betsy put it together, but it would have been something similar to what she would have done. To date, this is the highest price paid for a single piece of furniture ever, $2.75. While the possible connection to Betsy Ross may be part of the reason why it went for a lot of money, certainly the amazing craftsmanship also was factored into the cost. So if you have any interest in learning more about Betsy Ross, there's a really good book out there by Marla Miller where I got some of my research for this talk. I want to give her credit for this presentation, a lot of the information and research that she has done. Thank you.